Welcome to the next episode of the multi-award-winning FieroCast. I am your host, Mike Croyer. First, I'd like to thank all of the listeners for making FieroCast the most listened to podcast for the Fiero. FieroCast has received another award from Corporate Concepts for Best Single Vehicle Automotive Podcast in the Midwest for 2025. So again, thank you for making this a award-winning podcast. Today, we will be looking at what 2026 brings us. Then we will jump into our part 2 of our 2-part series on the Fiero engines. This episode will cover the 2.8-liter 6-cylinder engine. I am your host, Mike Croyer, and you are listening to the newest episode of FieroCast, the only podcast dedicated to the Pontiac Fiero and the Fiero community. You can find past FieroCast episodes at fierofocus.com, on our YouTube channel, and on our Facebook page. We'd like to thank our FieroCast supporters for this new 2026 season: the Fiero Store, Rodney Dickman, Bonter Solutions, the Midwest Fiero Clubs, Golden Eye Graphic, the N.I.F.E Store, N.I.F.E, and Auto Modella. If you'd like to become a supporter of FieroCast with a 20-second infomercial, you can email me with your information, and we will then create and include the infomercial into our FieroCast at no charge to you. Free advertisement. How can you beat that? All right, let's get started. So, 2026. We're fresh, new into the year. It's cold, and we're already thinking warm weather. So there's a lot of excitement that comes with 2026 for the car hobbyist as well as the Fiero community. Join us monthly N.I.F.E's Zoom meetings that are open to all Fiero owners. You can check out the topics for the February and March meetings at fierofocus.com, as well as the Facebook page N.I.F.E Club. The April and May Zoom meetings should be posted very soon, and you can get an idea of what to look for on those. If you have not already done so, you can register for reminders on the February and March meetings. You can go to, again, the Facebook page or fierofocus.com, register, and you will get notified when the meeting is and when the meeting will start. And if you have not already known about N.I.F.E, N.I.F.E is celebrating their 35th anniversary this year. The birthday won't happen until October, but it is, again, 35 years of N.I.F.E. Be sure to check back often at fierofocus.com, as well as the Facebook page for exciting news about N.I.F.E turning 35. Also this year, Fiorama, their premier N.I.F.E event, is celebrating its 30th anniversary, and the date for this year's event is Sunday, September 13th. But, as you know, the event runs all weekend, with events planned for Friday and Saturday. Again, be sure to check back at fierofocus.com and the two Facebook pages, N.I.F.E Club and Fiorama, for all the latest information on this year's celebratory event. If you are interested in becoming a key sponsor for Fiorama this year, you can reach out to Jim Hallman at jhallman@fierofocus.com. Outside of the Fiero community this year, there are big events happening with not only the 250th anniversary of the United States, but we as a Fiero community, we all own Pontiacs, and Pontiac is celebrating its 100th anniversary, as well as, you've all heard it, you've probably driven on it, the Mother Road, Route 66, is also celebrating its 100th anniversary. Events for both of these are still being finalized through with the Route 66 through each state. Each state will have a celebration. Scheduled times, days are TBD right now, but Be sure to check back if you are in a state that 66 goes through. There will be a celebration. And the big celebration happening in Michigan is the 100th anniversary of Pontiac. Be sure to check out their sites often for information as these events get closer. The Pontiac celebration information can be found through the Pontiac Oakland Museum website. On top of all of the other Fiero events this year that are happening across the U.S., be sure to get these events on your calendar, along with the other Fiero shows. So let's have one of the Fiero's best years. 2026, we'll say, is the year of the Fiero. All right, now let's jump into the 2.8 liter six-cylinder Fiero engine. The previous Fiero cast, if you want to dive into that, we talked about the 2.5 liter four-cylinder. This one, we're gonna, jump and talk more about what it is. We discussed again what the first engine offered in the Pontiac Fiero, the 2.5 liter four-cylinder Iron Duke engine. The second engine of choice offered in the Fiero, beginning in the 1985 model year, was the L44, a 150.8 cubic inch, 2.8 liter, 60-degree V6. Now, this engine was part of the General Motors 60-degree V6 GM high value engine family, which were produced with two different blocks. One for longitudinal applications in rear-wheel drive cars, and one of the transverse applications in front-wheel drive cars. There were differences in the engines and accessories mounts between these two blocks, but the two were not, unfortunately, they were not interchangeable. These engines were also referred to as the X engines, based on their first use in the GM X-body cars. The entire family of engines, with displacements ranging from 2.5 to 3.4 at 152 cubic inch to 204 cubic inch, had cast iron blocks and either cast iron or aluminum heads, with valve cam in block or overhead valve configurations, except for the LQ1 engine, which used a 24 valve driven by dual overhead cams, or the DOHC. Production of these clean sheet design engines began in 1980, with U.S. production ending, unfortunately, in 2005. These V6 engines continued to be produced in China until the latest 2010. But unlike the Iron Duke, during its production life, the V6 engines experienced many technical changes. Versions of these engines were used in a myriad of applications within GM and some of the products of GM's Japanese affiliates, Isuzu. The engine designations and the vehicle in which the engines were used were the Generation I, the 2.8 liter LE2 had a transverse configuration produced in 1980 through 1986 for the GM A and X body cars. Now, the standard X-Code engine was equipped with a two-barrel carburetor, produced 115 horsepower in 1980. Then, between 82 and 86, it produced 112 horsepower and 135 pounds a foot for torque. The cylinder bore was about 3.5 inches, and the stroke was about 3 inches. The first generation engine was used in not only the Skylark, the Buick Century, the Oldsmobile Omega, the Pontiac Phoenix, the Chevrolet Citron, the Pontiac 6000, and the Chevrolet Celebrity. As part of the first generation, that was the 2.8L LH7 that was introduced in 1981, was a high output Z code version of the LE2 for use in the higher performance X body cars like the Chevy Cintron X11 and the A body cars like the Pontiac 6000 STE, but it still used a two-barrel carburetor and produced 135 horsepower at 165 pounds per foot of torque for the 1981. And then in between 82 and 84 version, it produced 145 pounds a foot of torque. And this high output version was used in the Skylark T-Type, the Omega SX, the Phoenix SJ, the Citation X11, the Pontiac 6000 STE, and the Isuzu Trooper and Trooper 2. Then, as they move into 1985, the LH7 was replaced with the MFI L44, which was produced through 1988. It was the first transverse 2.8 liter to utilize the multi-port fuel injection and was a high output 9 code engine, and it had the option of a higher performance in the A body cars, the X body cars, and the Pontiac Fiero. This engine produced 140 horsepower at 5,200 RPMs and 170 pounds foot of torque at 3,600 RPMs. Now, this engine's camshaft had cylinder heads were later reused in the L32 3.4 liter engines. And some of the cars that had this high output version were the 85 to 88 Pontiac Fiero, as well as the Pontiac 6000 STE, the Chevy Celebrity Eurosport, and the Citation X11. Now, the LB6 engine was introduced in 1985 to replace the original LE2. It had used a multi-port fuel injection and was not considered a high output engine, only producing 130 horsepower. And these vehicles that they had put them in were the Buick Century, the Cadillac Cimarron, the Chevy Cavalier, the Citation again, the Celebrity, the 6000 LE, the Frionza, the Beretta, Corsica, and that was the main engine for those guys. Now, the LG6 or the D code, which was produced from 1990 to 1996 in both a transverse and longitudinal application, it utilized the throttle body injection and iron heads, which produced only 120 horsepower at 170 pounds a foot of torque. And these vehicles, which were the Lumina, the Silhouette, the Pontiac Transport, and the Isuzu Pickup, and the Isuzu Rodeo. So there, again, you can see all of the different applications that these cars had utilizing a 2.8. But the LH7 V6, which is found in our Fieros, built by Chevy, was under consideration as an optional power plant for the 84 Fiero. But, however, that engine wasn't a simple drop-in. In place of the Iron Duke, there were some modifications that needed to happen in order for that to fit. In its then current form, the V6 required considerable modifications for use in the Fiero. Additionally, the Fiero was to be an all-new modern car and Ron Rogers one of the Fiero engines. So, the LH7 V6, which is found in our Fieros, was built by Chevy and was under consideration as the optional power plant for the 84 Fiero. However, the engine wasn't a simple drop-in. In place of the Iron Duke, In its then current form, the V6 required considerable modifications for use in the Fiero. Additionally, the Fiero was to be an all-new modern car, and Ron Rogers of the Fiero engineering team didn't want the Fiero introduced with an optional high-output engine that utilized a carburetor. So therefore, the Fiero team waited for the 85 multi-port fuel injection equipped engine. The MPFI used port injectors manufactured by Rochester under license from Bosch, located in a close proximity to the intake valves on a common fuel rail maintained at 43 psi. Unlike the Chevy version of the engine, the Pontiac engine delivers fuel based on the speed density measurement system. The ECM receives input regarding the throttle position, the engine speed, and ambient air temperature, and adjusts the fuel mixture based on the data matrix, developed on a dyno and stored in the ECM's memory. This is the same engine that would be used in the 85 Pontiac 6000 STE, but the engines used in the Fieros have a stamping on the front of the block between the right cylinder head. For the 85, the stamping was either CBX or CBY. And then for the 86, the stamping was DAF, DAH, or DBN. And then for the 87, it was SCN or SCP. And then the last year, the 88, the stamping was CFC or CFD. Use of this engine in the Fiero required a special intake manifold and a redesigned deck lid. In the Fiero, the redesigned intake, with that, the engine had produced 140 bhp at 5,200 RPMs, 10 more horsepower than the engine in the 6000 STE. But the redesigned three-piece intake manifold consists of a cast aluminum base plate and fits in the valley of the cylinder banks, a crossover runner section, and a plenum upper runner, all of which formed the tuned length intake system. It produced a maximum torque when it resonates at 3,600 RPMs. The intake runner length necessary to resonate is quite long. So it was necessary for the engineers to fold everything up to make it fit, requiring the runners to double back underneath the plenum on the way to the individual cylinders. Viewed from the front of the engine in a cross section, it looks like an octopus with a tangled tentacle. The resonator was an expansion chamber, or wide spot, in the otherwise smooth intake pipe. The air flowing to the cylinder head intake post was kinetic energy, and once the intake valve closes, the moving column of air stopped, compresses, and then bounces back. The result was a high pressure area within the intake runner that caused an obstruction to incoming air, limiting the airflow. Adding this extension chamber to the intake forces the rebounding airflow to slow as it expands to fill the expansion chamber, thus expending a great deal of energy and reducing the back pressure. But the slowing of the air that was already present in the intake prevents the slowing of the incoming fresh air flowing towards the engine, thereby allowing a more uniform airflow and more complete filling of the chambers. Now, the resonator helped the engine produce more power, but because of internal combustion engine is nothing more than an air pump, more air requires more power produced. So, an additional modification for the 85 was the use of the Board Diagnostics 1, or OBD1, which managed the increasingly complex operation of the engine. improving efficiencies and reducing emissions. Now, since the LH7 was now a high output version of the engine, it had a higher compression ratio, 8.5 to 1 or 8.9 to 1. It had larger valves at 1.72 inches versus the 1.6 inch intake, a 1.42 inch versus a 1.3 inch exhaust, and higher lift cams from going to a 0.394 from a 347 intake, and a 0.410 versus a 0.394 exhaust, which increases the opening duration from 196 to a 196, from a 178 intake, and a 203 versus a 196 exhaust, as measured in the degrees of duration. There are no other notable modifications to the engine for 86. However, in the late 1987 production run, the Fiero's 2.8 liter switched from an externally balanced camshaft to an internally balanced camshaft. This change included an improvement in the oil pan and gasket and timing chain cover. All of the 1988 V6 Fieros should include these with the late 87 changes. The changes that came in 1988 were unfortunately a reduction in piston weight, or 90 grams, as well as a change in the manufacturing process of the pistons. The pedal type injectors were replaced with Maltec injectors in an effort to reduce injector fouling. But reviews at the time of the Fiero's V6 introduction, a lot of the performance of the 2.8 liter V6 stating that the engine is smooth, sounds great, and has good torque, although it runs out of urge at about 5,000 RPMs. Writer Ron Grable stated in the November 1984 issue of Motor Trend that the engine was turbine smooth, responsive, and happy at its work. And approaching the 5,200 RPM red line, it's pulling just as hard as it does in any part of your rev range. And it is a shame to have a shift up because it feels the sound and feels so good. That, in a nutshell, is how the 2.8 liter in the Fiero came about. If you like a copy of the writing and the resources with footnotes, you can contact our membership director for a copy of the March-April issue of Fiero Focus magazine, issue number 2, 2017. Thank you again for listening to the newest episode of FieroCast. This FieroCast was written by N.I.F.E member Christopher Sass, produced by Golden Eye Graphic, and is a production of the Northern Illinois Fiero Enthusiasts. Thank you for joining me today. I am your host, Mike Croyer, and thank you for listening to the newest episode of FieroCast. This is episode 56, and it is the only podcast dedicated to the Pontiac Fiero and the Fiero community. If you'd like more information or have any ideas on a future FieroCast, you can email me at mkroyer@fierofocus.com. Remember to keep Fieroing, and good night, Fiero owners, wherever you are.